Asha mentioned, I'm just going to give you kind of a brief overview, share a few of my own stories, and then we can jump in. While I'm talking, if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I will answer what I can in the chat afterwards, and we can maybe share some of those out as well. So if you want more details or if there's something I'm not hitting, go ahead and pop it in the chat. All right, let's move this forward. So as Natasha mentioned, I'm a lawyer. I work mostly actually in policy and student data privacy. So I do not practice in disability rights law, but I do know a lot about it. And I've done a lot of presentations for folks on the legal side of things. I'm a storyteller, telling mostly my story of disability. And I am also an accessibility coach, so helping companies think through how to make their companies and structures more accessible for their employers. So today I'm going to review some legal frameworks and then talk about some best practices for revealing or coming out with as somebody who's disabled in the workplace, and then we'll have some time to share some stories. So to give you a little background on myself, I am able passing. I manage a chronic illness. I got bit by a tick back in 2004, so 17, 18 years ago, and 2003, sorry, and have been battling kind of Lyme disease and chronic illness, including chronic fatigue ever since. And so this is a picture taken on these are pictures taken on the same day, one at work in an office where I was feeling really great, and the second on my walk home where I couldn't take another step and ended up kind of having to take a serious break and solid rest just on the asphalt, because that is where my body landed. And so the nature of my personal disability and chronic illness is something that's pretty changing. And so it's been really difficult for me to figure out what accommodations I would even ask for. It's also been difficult for me to like identify as somebody who has a disability. And it's been kind of a long process. But my life is really subsumed and has been for almost 20 years with managing chronic illness. And that's everything from doctor's appointments, 3 years ago, I think I went to 180 different doctor's appointments in 1 year, tracking medical records, taking lots of different medications, managing medications. I had a central line for intravenous antibiotics for a while, and all sorts of other medical interventions. Some of these are easier to talk about and show to an employer, and some of them are just really complicated. And as an employee, I have managed everything from multiple doses of injections per day on a job site to just things like needing to have access to a place to lay down, or working half days, working from home. And we can get into a little bit more of like the accommodations that I've asked for that have helped me manage my own particular situation. Of course, everyone on this call is really different. And so what has worked for me will of course be different. And I am in no way here to try to tell you exactly what to do or how to manage your own case. I just want to give you some ideas and some best practices. So I'm going to start with an overview of the law. So disability is a legally defined term, and it means when somebody has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. And so this is a pretty wide definition, and there's lots of things that fall into this. People can be disabled, and they can be disabled for a short period of time, a long period of time, their entire life. It can be a wide spectrum of what the words substantially limits and major life activity mean. It can be everything from standing to learning to communicating. All of these are things that can be considered a disability. And so I encourage people, and especially employers, when I'm working with employers, to think about disability much more broadly than they are. Usually when I'm talking to a company, they'll talk about wheelchair ramps or elevators, and like that is important physical accessibility. But 20% of the US population manages a disability, and that can be very wide ranging. And it's not just actual physical disabilities, but can be, different neurocognitive functioning as well. So most workplaces are protected by the ADA, which of course most of you know about. The Americans with Disabilities Act was passed in 1990, and it prohibits the discrimination against individuals with disabilities in all area of public life, which includes jobs. Now, the ADA applies to every employer that has 15 employees or over. So if you're at a very small firm or company, the ADA actually technically does not apply, but it doesn't mean that your employer is unfamiliar with it or wouldn't want to or be familiar with the idea of accommodations. The ADA, as a quick summary, applies to workplaces and public places, so things like court buildings, parks. It's a very broad civil rights law, including all places of public accommodation. And it requires the person who owns the place to make reasonable accommodations as long as they don't create undue hardship on the employer. And so we can dive into that a little bit more, but essentially it's a weighing and a calculus for employers. So they're like, if you employ, let's say 20 people and the company only makes $1 million a year and somebody needs an accommodation that costs $500,000 a year, that is an undue hardship on the employer, and they don't technically have to do that under the law. Now, a lot of times the ADA is not invoked. You don't really want to get to the point with an employer where you're talking about this law or even like trying to invoke it in any sort of way. You really want to do all the work to avoid having to like rely on the ADA. Although it's like an important backstop, an important thing that employers do know about, and that they want to like help limit their liability against. So I think it's like a very important tool. However, I always tell employers, like, if you are actually talking and worried about the details of the ADA, like, you've done a bad job at doing all your pre-work, because you should have all sorts of systems in place so that, you know, worrying about the details of the ADA is not actually the fight you're fighting or where you are in the weeds. You want to be like, you know, tracking people, giving them accommodations. The average accommodation costs $400. So it's important to remember that this is a legal backstop, but one that hopefully we don't have to talk about much with our employer. So this is the undue hardship. Reasonable accommodation must be provided. It must be provided. So it must actually be provided when you ask for it. If it's reasonable, they have to give it to you, unless it would impose an undue hardship. An undue hardship is defined as an action requiring significant difficulty or expense in relation to the job site or employer resources. Again, that balancing act between how much your accommodation costs, what sort of, you know, HR hours or manager hours or, you know, actual dollar costs, versus like how much the company has overall. So if you work at a very big company like Google and you need a full desk setup and separate lights that don't trigger migraines, Google should definitely accommodate those. It's a large company. Those are tiny, tiny dollar amounts and tiny HR lifts for a large company. So a request for support, when you're making an actual request for support, you do not have to use the words disability. You don't have to say hardship. You don't have to say accommodation. There is no trigger word that an employer is looking for in order to start an accommodations conversation. It's important to know that under the law, a company or a manager can ask for things like a doctor's note or like any sort of like proof of your condition, but you do not have to give it to them. That is not a legal requirement. They can ask for it, you can refuse. Employers have the legal responsibility to accommodate you as long as it's not an undue hardship. So that's really important to know, especially if someone's asking you for a doctor's note, feel free to say no. And you can, in that case, say, you know, it's not required under the law. I really don't feel comfortable discussing my condition. I'd rather focus on the accommodations part. So let's talk a little bit about reasonable accommodations. What does an actual quote unquote reasonable accommodation look like? It's any modification or adjustment to a job or the work environment that will enable employees with disabilities to perform essential job functions. So if they're hiring you to think and you need certain accommodations in order to think better, whether that be noise canceling headphones, if you're working on a computer and you have some sort of physical disability, you need a special keyboard, all of those are reasonable accommodations to perform essential job functions. And if they're asking you to do something like there's a one-time conference that they've never asked for you to go to, and they ask for you to go to one year, and you can't because you have, or like you're going to need a lot of accommodations in order to do that conference. They can say no or take that, or say like, we're not going to send you to the conference because the accommodations cost too much, if that conference is not an essential job function. So employers do have the right to kind of play with the essential job function piece of this. Reasonable accommodations. If you don't know, askjan.org. That's the Job Accessibility Network. Get familiar with them. They are great. You can put in any sort of condition and they'll give you a list of possible accommodations. It's a great way to work with new HR managers or people who aren't very familiar with this conversation. And that can be anything from like working from home to blue light blocking glasses, extended deadlines, a standing desk, a seat near a bathroom, access to a room for pumping. There's a whole other set of laws around pregnant women, nursing women, et cetera, or nursing femmes. So there's a lot of possible accommodations. And if you're having trouble trying to figure out what you might need, going to Ask Jan, putting in a series or, a bunch of different things. It could be everything from lower back pain, to ADHD, and you'll see a whole list of possible accommodations, and you can figure out which ones might work for you and then bring that list to your employer. Okay, so one of the things I hear a lot from employers is like, well, one, we don't have any disabled people, which is like obviously a lie. And then two, they're like, well, people don't ask us for accommodations. And so as part of I find my job when I'm asking for accommodations is doing some educating of whoever I'm asking, whether that be a manager or HR person. And usually that's like talking about why other people aren't coming forward or why it took me a while to come forward. People often don't ask because maybe it's a long story or it's traumatic to retell. For me, it can be very emotionally exhausting to be like trying to talk about all 17 years and all of my possible conditions, for everything from like the chronic pain piece to like, lack of sleep to racing heart. Like, it's like, how much of that do I disclose? How much do I not? It can be really exhausting to try to like get someone caught up. People are often frequently disbelieved, especially if they're able passing. That can be really tricky. Often people think of asking for an accommodation as a social capital spend. So one of the things I work with employers on is creating some sort of system for asking for accommodation so that it's just like a normal track for everyone to go through. So it's not an extra ask for people with disabilities. Frequently, accommodations can change for folks. So what might work one month doesn't work the next. What might works one day doesn't work the next. And so being able to flex with the accommodation change is really important for disabled folks and can be tricky or like just unknown. Like HR and managers often don't know that. And so they're not good at flexing with it. And then there's also often issues of intersectionality. So if someone is of another group that is often discriminated against, let's say it's a BIPOC person who's also disabled, some of these things can come into play, and there can be either a larger stereotype threat, or if you're already feeling like there's a stereotype threat because of your other identities, coming forward with a disability can further make you feel, or make someone feel othered, or have it just be a blocker for bringing your accommodation forward. And a lot of people ask me about coming forward with disabilities, and I just want to say up front that you may be nervous, and I am always nervous, even though I've disclosed a bunch of times now, and that's for good reason. We do live in an incredibly ableist society, and there are risks to asking for an accommodation. And I think that like acknowledging that emotional toll, like why you might not have said something before, and then just kind of like acknowledging that like, the reason you're feeling like very scared about doing it, or, the reason that it's so hard is that the world is very ableist. And so like acknowledging that, and then like trying to figure out how to do the best you can, given the constraints that are on us from society. So here are my best practices for you. So the first is to study the people and the culture, meaning like how disability friendly is this place? Like, do they have, when you went through the interview process, did they ask you for what accommodations you need? that means at least they're thinking about it. If you are already in, if you are someone who doesn't need the accommodation during the interview process, then I spend a lot of time, trying to figure out who is the HR person who deals with this, what are they like, how much time do they have on their schedule. I try to figure out my manager and how well they're gonna, flex with me if I need flex, how much I need to tell people. I spend a bunch of time trying to figure that out first. If you're somebody who needs an accommodation to get through an interview, please go ahead and ask for it. I think if the company doesn't want to, or balks, or has a hard time giving you that accommodation, then you probably don't want to work for that company unless you're feeling really excited to do a lot of educating and do a lot of fighting and advocating for yourself. So I think it's a good screener for maybe a place that you wouldn't want to be. And then after you start working, I think it's best practice to ask pretty soon so that you've got some sort of legal recourse for yourself, especially if you're going to need the accommodations. I like to write out what I need and why. So I'll go to Ask Jan, I'll write down the accommodations I need. Sometimes I'll group them. So in the beginning, when I didn't know what accommodations would be super helpful for me, I'd come with a smaller list of like 1 or 2 and be like, hey, can we try these for 3 months? Check in 3 months and see if I need more or less, or if we can remove one or add one, and make it a longer iterative process where I'm meeting with the hiring manager every couple months. If I can do every couple months, every couple days, if you need every couple days, but put in place a process of checking in if you're someone whose accommodations are going to change. I try to make myself emotionally ready because these conversations are always awkward. I have just not met a hiring manager do it well for me. I have heard great stories from other friends, but it just hasn't been my experience that anyone is very good at these. So I try to make myself emotionally ready. Sometimes that means meditating. Often that means reminding myself that I am not my work, and that the world is ableist, and that I'm going to do the best I can. I try to make sure I schedule adequate time for a meeting and have it be the whole and only thing we're talking about in the meeting. I find that people like to skip through disability conversations and they don't like to get into the details because it makes them feel awkward because they're dealing with some ableism themselves. So I try to make a whole meeting just about the accommodation. I try to schedule it towards the end of the day so that I can take the rest of the day off if I need to, if the meeting goes poorly. I try to not schedule back-to-back meetings. So if I have an accommodations meeting, I'm not sure how it's going to go, I try not to schedule a call directly after it in case I'm emotionally triggered. I recommend that everyone take notes during the conversation, and even if your employer is, because it's really important to write a follow-up email, or maybe they have a form that you need to fill out, but follow the practice that documents what you've said and what you've asked for, the date you've asked for it, when they've committed to getting the thing. So if you're like, I need to work from home every Wednesday because I need a break in the middle of the week, they're like, you're going to write down work from home Wednesday. When does it start? 1/22/2021. It will continue for 3 months and we'll check in. So writing all those pieces out and putting it in an email so that you make sure you're on the same page with the other person. I always schedule a follow-up meeting, just I can always cancel it if I need to, but for a month or so out so that gives me time to ask for additional accommodation, to fix something if it's broken. And then I try to keep the trust by being honest and proactive. So if an accommodation isn't working for me, then I let them know, ask for something different. And I try to be really proactive so that in my first job, I essentially didn't ask for, or I vaguely talked about my disability, but didn't have real concrete accommodations in place. They were kind of given to me by word of mouth. And I ended up in a really big crash, and I ended up having to go all the way out on disability leave for 6 months. And if I had been proactive in that first place, I wouldn't have ended up out on disability leave, I don't think. So those are just some of the kind of best practices. The other thing I would remind people is that you're talking about the accommodations and not necessarily your diagnosis. You don't have to tell them what your diagnosis is. You just need to say what you need. So rather than being I have Crohn's, you could say, I need a seat near the bathroom. Or I need access to, the Sharps container that is here. You don't have to tell them why you need access to the Sharps container. You just say that you need a Sharps container and you need it to be in the bathroom or whatever. So you really want to focus and tell people you're doing that. I'm going to focus on what I need rather than why I need it, because what we're trying to do here is make sure that I can do my job. And you don't need the details of my diagnosis and medical history to do that. So keeping it kind of high level and focusing on the action items rather than the diagnosis and condition can be is a best practice that people recommend, myself included. So a couple things to keep in mind when you're asking is that when you're asking, you're not only helping yourself, but like everyone else who's disabled. Now, it doesn't mean you need to ask, but I do think about this whenever I'm feeling really nervous about asking. I'm like, all right, if everyone who needed an accommodation asked, the whole world would get better at giving accommodations, and it would happen faster if we could like all come together and actually ask, and that way it would become a normal thing rather than it being kind of this like one-off, highly emotionally charged issue that it can be right now. So I really think that, like, you know, for 20% of the working population, the louder we get, the more companies will have to respond. And I do think that, like, if you are someone who doesn't need a lot of accommodations, but like maybe might at some point, I think it's always good to have that like pinged in an HR file somewhere. Maybe I wouldn't tell your manager, maybe I would just tell HR, so that it can be written down, so that if you ever need to pull a ripcord and get that accommodation, you can, and you've already told somebody about it. I do think it's like everybody has got their own comfort level with what they're going to say, how they're going to say it, when they're going to say it. And I want to encourage everyone to like really think and reflect for your own self on what your path will be, and then to just make sure that you're prepared for whatever path you choose. Okay, that's all I've got for presentation. I know we want to get to a point where we are able to share some stories and share some best practices, and, you know, maybe talk about what other people have done and how it's gone, and maybe answer some questions. You can reach me at this email address or on my website if you've got further questions or you want to follow up. I'm also on LinkedIn. So I'm going to turn it over to Natasha.